My name's Darrell Green, associate chaplain with Unlocked, and we're gonna kick off something new, something a little bit special today. Just gonna invite you to look at a conversation that we're having with one of our longtime mentees, Alexis. It's just a real conversation about her experiences, about God, and this is just a little peek into the work that God's doing that's going on behind prison walls. Um, and God's doing amazing things. And we just invite you to have a snapshot, a peek into this journey of what it looks like taking the peace of the gospel into the chaos and the violence and the oppression and everything that's going on behind prison walls.
Yes, yes. Aloha, everybody. My name is John. We're so blessed to be able to love and support our young people who've been incarcerated in King County, Washington, and beyond. We're doing this video session for several reasons. One is to highlight the voices of our young people and to allow you to hear directly from them. We want to elevate the voices of our young people. We're also doing this to highlight the mission of Unlocked. We want to give you a flavor and a feel for what we do, as Darrell mentioned. And most of all, we want to highlight how God is moving in our young people and to, in all that we say and do, we want to glorify God. And, the way we incorporate young people like this, we have to be really careful because we don't want it to seem like we're trying to pump up our mission, pump up our ministry by using them or by using their stories. Um, and at the same time, we want to show you as real as possible what God's doing and what we're doing, and the opportunity God's giving us. So we only incorporate our young people so publicly like this, young people who really want to do it, and young people who with whom we have a solid relationship. And this is certainly the case with Alexis. We're so excited that Alexis is able to join us and can't wait for you guys to hear directly from her.
My name is Scott Hall, and we're here with Unlocked. We're a ministry in the state of Washington that invests in mentoring and discipling young people who are incarcerated. And we get to be here today with Alexis Hale. I've got my colleagues John Abe and Darrell Green. And I have known Alexis, I think, since 2020 during COVID. I think the first like 6 months of me knowing her, I only knew her from the bridge of her nose and up on Zoom calls like this. But I have seen Alexis do deep work on herself and seen that bear fruit. And so, Alexis, I just thought I want to invite you to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about how you grew up, and some of the different steps that led you to the point of getting locked up.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Alexis Hale. I'm 24 now. I've been incarcerated since I was 17. I'm originally from New Mexico, born and raised and very prideful. I talk about it probably at least once a week. Yeah, growing up back home, I grew up, my mom was very young when she had me. She was 16. I've never met my father. He was, he didn't want to be in my life. And he was a gang member, and his choices just did not allow him to be a father. I grew up in a home where there was a lot of abuse, physically, emotionally, mentally, all of it. And I was predominantly raised by my mother, but there was a long period of time when I was in and out of foster care, and I lived with my grandma. And then when I got into like my teenage years, I was homeless for a couple years. So yeah, it was really hard. I grew up all over New Mexico, a little bit in Texas, and there was just a lot of drugs and abuse. And so at a very young age, I learned, as a woman, I was taught that it's your job to kind of to be obedient to the man in your life. I watched my mom fight addiction and be in abusive relationships my whole life up until she moved out of the state. So it was I'm the oldest of four, and so I very much was, a parent in its own situation. And yeah, I was fortunate enough to never intensely struggle with addiction, but I definitely was around it all the time. And I always tell people that I was afraid of drugs myself because I've seen what they did to the people in my family. But at the same time, I also had this, I guess, like philosophy that like, okay, I'm homeless, I'm a woman, I can't afford to like be high and like just like unprotected, right? Because bad things happen to women in those situations. Um, yeah, I have been through a lot, really. And when I was about 15, 16, I had hit a point. I had a really amazing, relationship with somebody, but as a young girl, you can't, I was playing house at such a young age, and I was, broken, and my mom was missing, and I hadn't seen my siblings, and I was in and out of treatment centers. And so I, was couch surfing, and yeah, it just got to a point where I had nothing in life. You know what I mean? I was completely homeless. And you make choices when you're in those situations that like you are ashamed of. And so I finally told my grandmother that I wanted to like go and live with my mom wherever she was, and my grandma said, well, she's up there in Washington. And so I came on the Amtrak at 15 all by myself. I came up here and started to live with my mom. By then, my mom was sober and doing well, and she had custody of my sister. And CPS in New Mexico said, if you go and live with your mom, then we'll give her custody of you. Like you have been on the run all these years. I was on like New Mexico's missing children's list. I was on one of the bulletin boards in Walmart. And so I moved up here, and it was definitely a culture shock. It's vastly different than New Mexico. And having been like a feral child growing up in New Mexico to moving up here. But I definitely did not have I've always been very smart and adaptable, but I did not have the realization of like all of my trauma as a child, how it was going to impact my present. I just had no
Mm.
conceptualization. All I knew is like, I wanted to be nothing like my mom. And I was just like my mom in every way, and so when I moved up here, my mom was a good mom, and she did everything she was supposed to. But by then, I think people always ask me, well, what could have happened for you to not have gone to prison? And I've thought about it all these years. And I just don't know, because when I moved up here, my mom got me in therapy, and I was taking medication, and she had me like, enrolled in the GED program, everything that like she could have done to try to like reshape me from the years back home. But I didn't want it. I didn't know how to receive it. I just wasn't in a place to absorb it. And so I came up here and very quickly, got a boyfriend, and he was not good to me at all. He was a little bit older than me. Um, yeah, so I was very much making choices without understanding like why I was making those choices, and as a young girl, I learned you have to prove that you're worthy of being loved, and you have to, prove yourself, and make somebody feel like I definitely like need her around. Like she's worth it because she's this or she's that or she's capable or she does this for me. So I very much had this mindset, having watched my mom do it, and her at one point telling me as a child, like, if he hits you, it's probably because you did something to make him angry. It's your job, and it's your job to provide, and you have to be obedient, and you prove yourself, and one day, you know what I mean, like this so-called like trial of like if you're good enough will stop, right? And you will have a good relationship. So I very much went into that relationship with my co-defendant with that mindset. And and yeah, it led me to prison.
Mm. Thanks, Alexis. John or Darrell, were you wanting to ask or follow up on anything?
Oh, but I'd love to ask the next question.
That'd be great, John.
Yeah, Alexis, well, I remember having a conversation with you, one of the first conversations we've had, and we got to sit down and you talked about your faith. And I just walked away from that conversation being so amazed and inspired, because all the trauma that you've been through, all the challenges, it'd be reasonable for someone to say, man, I don't care about God. If there's a God, why did God let me go through all this stuff? But instead of having that mindset, you chose to move towards God. And yeah, tell us more about your faith, please.
Yeah, well, I definitely did go through those periods where I was like, God isn't real, or he doesn't love me, or why does he do this? And he's all powerful. All these things, I definitely have gone through that. Especially, when I was younger, I grew up in and out of church. At one point, my family was Catholic and pagan and Christian. So I definitely experienced, religion and spirituality as a whole growing up. But my lifestyle did not suit that. You know what I mean? And so I always, dabbled with my relationship with God, but I definitely didn't pursue it the way I have now in my adulthood. But I would honestly say that like my mother has been very influential, impactful. I call her like my lighthouse to God. That's how I view her because having watched her go through her own experiences, and as a woman, right, as a survivor, and we talk very briefly, and I always share with her my thoughts, and a lot of times they've clashed, and we don't get along, but she always manages to say certain things that I'm like, okay, I'll listen to her. You know what I mean? And it really has brought me closer. Um, but I think over the years, whenever when I was arrested, I was 17 and I had nobody. I spent almost 2 years just all by myself in a cell. And people say it's cliche or it's corny that, oh, you meet God in jail cell, and you're, all these things. They always have these stereotypes of like, oh, now you want to have a relationship with God that you're in jail, right? But for me, I think I was at like the first time in my life really forced to be alone with myself. I mean, I was a young girl and I always had people around me and I couldn't stand the silence. I always had to have music or I had to like have conversation. I couldn't just be
Mm,
alone with myself. You know what I mean? And I remember in my juvie, um, I looked at myself in the mirror in our cell and I was scared of myself. Like my eyes made me uncomfortable. Like it gave me anxiety and I looked away. And I just could, like, it
mm,
did something for me where I was like, wow, like you are really uncomfortable with yourself. It's not like, oh, I'm a girl, I'm uncomfortable with my body. It was so much deeper than that. And I would just read, the Bible and kind people, there was this woman named Allison in my juvie and she was my teacher. And now I consider her like my grandma. She's followed me through these years and she was so loving and kind to me. And so when I would read the Bible, right, it would talk about, giving love and it's, all these things, right, that talked about a good character, and I would see it in these people and I'm like, oh, I wonder if that's what that looks like. Because I had no idea what it looked like to be a good person. I didn't conceptualize any of that. And so I wanted to be a better person. And when I first became incarcerated, and I quickly learned, that like my victim's family believed I'm not remorseful. They thought like I didn't care, that I guess maybe found pleasure in what happened, all these things. And I was so like taken back, and I didn't understand really like why they thought that. I didn't know what was being told to them or how they were just digesting the horrible things that happened. But it really bothered me, because I've always been sorry. I've always been remorseful. And I realized like, okay, well, you can be those things, but you also have to express it. You have to show that you are. So it just made me really dive deeper into like being a better person and like what it means to have character and values. And so that's why I would read the Bible and I'd be like, okay, and then I just started to learn more. I was just so uneducated with life and people, and when you are stripped of like possibility and hope, you really cling to anything, you know what I mean? And I would say that God, like, he refused to leave me. I remember I would like be in my juvie cell and I would start to like envision, okay, if I had an older sister, you know what I mean? Or if my mom was here right now and she could tell me all the things that I wanted her to tell me, like what would she say? And so I started to like talk to myself, and it probably sounds like so crazy, but I would talk to myself in third person, like, Alexis, you're great. Like, I'm sorry this happened to you. And it really like did something to me, you know what I mean? Because nobody's ever told me, I've sat in front of hundreds of people, they know my horrible story, and no one's ever, I don't know. I mean, people are like, "Oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Gosh, that's really wow. You're so strong." But it was never like, it was never deep. And it's something different to hear it from yourself. And yeah, I was just a lot of, I think that the reason that I like grew my relationship with God at first was all in the pursuit of like wanting my victim's family to see that like I've always been sorry, and like I am remorseful. And then over time, right, you cling on to God and he clings on to you, and then it becomes more of like you and him building. Yeah, I would say like me having a relationship with God is really like, I mean, I believe, right, like it's a two-way street, definitely, but he just like he never left me. And I think like I have like the honor of being able to hear him, tell me like, hey, I was with you when all those horrible things happened to you. Like, I'm here with you now, and like I love you so much. I'm doing your prison sentence with you. And I don't know. I would say like it's something, in the Bible, or always talks about like a peace and like a relationship that like humans don't understand, right? And so therefore, if humans don't understand it, it's really hard for me to explain it. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's something that like I'm still discovering on how my relationship with him has shaped me, because I think that it's made me who I am. And having pillars like you gentlemen, right? Like, you guys show up every day, you guys teach me consistency, and I can rely on you, and you guys are good men. And Scott gave me this book years ago, and it was talking about how like your relationship with God, right? And giving him praise and glory, but yet recognizing like you have to show up too. You know what I mean? Like, you have to put the work into having a relationship. And I'm a very prideful person. And so for me, like integrity and like being a woman of my word, all these things are super important to me, right? And I always wanted people to like me leave a room and they say good things, and I realized like, okay, how does that correlate to like being like Jesus? It's definitely a relationship. It's not like he doesn't do it all by himself, because if he did, the world would not be as ugly as it is, right? Humans have to put the work in. And it's one of the hardest things I've ever done, definitely.
Thanks, Alexis. Go ahead, Darrell.
Um, the next question we got here, um, some we've talked about a little bit, and it's always been one of the traits about yourself that I really found admirable and respectable. Just the way you respond to adversity, and keeping the calmness and about yourself. And so like, we know you've in the media, you haven't been portrayed in a positive light. And way different than the person that we've got to know. And like you said, even if people did know your story, and it was kind of that pretentious, like, I feel bad for you, or glad that ain't my life, like that type of energy. But you haven't really been given a voice in the situation. And so like, you kind of, what would you have to say, kind of maybe either to those people that portrayed you. I don't know if that'd be uh, cool to talk about that, or just like, what do you have to say, now that you have an opportunity kind of to just have a voice and, just talk about you not being that same person that you were back then. Because I think that the same people that might have been able to look at you and see like maybe a not remorseful type of face, it's really that trait of that you have of kind of being able to be like be resilient, and so just
Yeah. Oh gosh. I think that, yeah, that trait that you speak of, um, sometimes I think maybe I was born with it, but I also think like having lived with the trauma that I've undergone, and just constant, I mean, I experienced trauma before I was even able to conceptualize that it happened. Um, that people are afraid of what they don't understand or don't know. And I think that, um, I've watched some of the TV shows about me and I've seen myself, and it makes me feel, I used to hate myself, I used to hate my 16-year-old self because I was just so angry with how she's either handled things or the, the politically incorrect things that she says, just like anything, and it took me a long time to realize like, hey, like she's still you, and have compassion for myself. I also think that, as a woman, being able to express and show remorse or, really any emotion, you have to be so careful because it's easy for people to say, oh, she's hysterical or she's emotionally manipulating because she's crying so much. Or for me, I didn't cry, when I was sitting in an interrogation room. It wasn't that I wasn't sorry, it was that I was terrified, and I was in there with two men. And trauma changes you. The way that trauma has impacted me and influenced me, um, it's made me build walls to protect myself, and I think that that's what people see in the shows is I was just trying to survive. What I did is the worst thing I'll ever do in my entire life, and I'll forever have regret and guilt for what I've done. And um, I've done intense work and I'll forever do it. I think like the burden of the burden that I carry of having committed the crime that I've committed, it's your responsibility to be consciously aware of how you've impacted. You know what I mean? My victim's family, how I impacted society, how I've, just putting that harm out there. You know what I mean? Like the spiritual harm that I've done is so impactful, and it's my responsibility to always be aware of that and to never minimize it. And so over these years of working through my trauma, I remember when I was being sentenced, I told my victim's family, my letter was addressed to them. And I told them that I had no idea why I had done what I did and that I would figure it out and I would make sure that I helped other people never do what I've done. And I upheld that. A lot of me, people look at kind of my rap sheet while I've been incarcerated and they're like, wow, you've done amazing. And you've just constantly like, inclined and all these great things. And I can definitely say that my first few years, I did it all for the family. I wanted them so badly to see that like I've cared, I've always been sorry, that I should have gone to the police after the crime happened. I should have said something to somebody. I didn't do those things because I didn't care. I did it because I was afraid. I did it because I didn't understand. I was young. There's so many things that, unless you're there, unless you have experienced something similar, it's easy for people to have already said, I would never do that. Oh, well, the way she did that, or the way she did this. I'm not minimizing what I did at all, but I'm also saying people weren't there. They weren't in that car. They weren't dating that man. They weren't around Kevin. So it's hard for people, it's hard for me to hear when people say, oh, I wouldn't do that, you know, or I would have handled things like this because I don't, they weren't there. And I also, over the years of starting to figure myself out, and achieving things and growing and all these things, it definitely was geared towards my victim's family, Amanda, my victim's sister. Everything was for her to see like, okay, Alexis, she is sorry. I don't have to forgive her, but at least she's sorry. I've always had this belief that it's one thing for me to have committed my crime, like the harm that I've done is horrible. But it's a whole nother level of harm for me to not be sorry, and so I've tried to reach out to the family, and ask them, to do restorative justice. But I also respect their decision and, their boundary with me. I get it. But I always thought that, it's, I hope and pray that one day, right, Amanda could, I don't know, see this video or somehow want to reach out to me. And I just want her to know I'm sorry, yeah, I'm a monster in her life. I'm a monster in her children's lives. And it took me a long time to realize that, like, that's my, I guess, I don't know if responsibility is the right word, but, I caused them so much harm. And I think as a woman, like, she's a survivor of domestic violence. My mother is, I am. So just like to know that everything that harmed me as a child or harmed my mom, to know that I was on the other side of that for somebody else. Yeah, it's a pain and it's a guilt that I live with every single day. I feel it every single day. Um, and it's taken a lot for me to not like sabotage myself or my success or blame myself or beat myself up. I always thought like I didn't get enough years in prison. I always thought I should have gotten more. Um, but yeah, I've worked really intently on why I made the choices that I did. I didn't understand how my trauma and being raised the way that I was impacted my choices. Um, and it's 100% my childhood's fault and it's 100% my fault. Like I take a responsibility for my actions and the things that I've done. And when those TV shows came out, and people, I mean, I live on a campus where the kids were watching it, staff were watching it. And so I was I'm very ashamed. I'll always have shame and guilt for it. My siblings will one day watch them. My mother refuses. And when they came out, I was really like devastated. I was humiliated because I worked so hard to not distance from myself from who I was when the crime happened, but definitely like worked hard to show that like, hey, that is not me. I take responsibility for her, but like I'm not that same version of myself, yeah, I would love for, there to be a show where somebody asks me what happened. People want to make scenarios and yeah, they're right in the crime that I committed. But, I've seen some of them and they say that I grew up in a two-parent household and that I was never in poverty, that I, grew up in a gated community. And none of that's true. It's lies. And what it's really doing is harming the victim's family. And that is probably the worst thing out of everything.
Alexis, I appreciate you sharing from the heart like you are. There was a moment though, and that's something that you and I have talked about at least a few times, that initially a lot of that work that you were doing on yourself was for the victim's family, but then there was a shift somewhere. Do you know what I'm talking about? I feel like,
Yeah.
could you share a little bit about how that
Yeah.
shift happened?
Yeah. That shift happened. I realized, growing up, I clearly didn't love myself, right? I was not raised to even know what it meant to love myself. And I've learned that there's a million different versions of love in this world, and only a few of them are good and pure. And I realized there was that shift that you talk about when I discovered the TV shows, when I watched them and I seen myself, and it almost made me feel about that same thing I was sharing earlier, where I looked at myself in my juvie mirror and I was scared of myself, and so when I watched myself in those TV shows and the pictures of me and just the things that they were saying and how they were describing me, it felt so surreal because that's not who I am today. And so I was like really taken back at like sometimes, when you're growing and you're always like bettering yourself, you kind of forget to look at how far you've come, because it's just you're so tunneled in. And so looking at those things and just hearing what like, I've had staff come up to me and said that I would have to work even harder now to prove that I was a good person. I have people thinking that they glorify it. And so I really realized at that time period that I've grown to love and respect myself, because I was angry about the TV shows. And I don't know if I have a right to be, but I was angry because I thought that it actually was doing more harm for the family. Um, and I mean, I respect their decision, of course, with however they want to go with the harm that's happened to them. I respect that, but I felt so much pain for Amanda, the simple fact, right, that this horrific opportunity for her to sit and talk about the death of her sister, I I made that happen, and that is just it's just I have so much guilt for that. But I also learned in the TV shows that watching them that like I worked really hard to grow and to heal, and almost to where I didn't even recognize the girl that they were portraying, that the facts that they were saying, or the lies, or just like the images of me. And I sat with myself and I was like, why does it bother you so much? Because my initial thing, like, I was like, oh my God, like, I was devastated. And then there was like, I would say, the devil popped in and he's like, how dare you be offended? Like, how dare you think you have a right to feel some type of way? Like, you did this. You mean like you're a murderer? You did this. Like, sit in your misery. Like, they should be saying horrible things about you. You're lucky it's not even worse. And then I felt like, God being my savior, he was like, no, kid, like, yeah, you did do something horrible. Yes, that's true. And let's look at what led you to be that version of yourself and look at how far you've come. You know what I mean? Like, I've clawed my way out of hell to not be that version of myself. And on top of that, learn to have compassion and love for that little girl because all she was trying to do was survive. And so the process, I mean, I'm still going through it. You know what I mean? I mean, just last night, I had a staff say, like, I'm sorry for when you get out and like the things you're going to see about yourself, and it definitely gives me shame because it makes me feel like nothing I ever do will, and somebody told me this, and maybe this is true, but they said no amount of good that you'll ever do will ever be compared to the worst thing you've ever done. Like, you'll never be able to level it, you'll never be able to get in front of it. And I've learned and I'm learning to be okay with that. And just to recognize that not everyone's going to want to hear my side of the story. Not everyone's going to want to respect me or believe that I've changed. I'm always going to be in somebody's eyes a temptress, or I seduce these men, or I'm evil because I don't cry enough, or now I cry too much. I mean, for example, like, I went from being somebody who I just couldn't cry to now I cry for movies, and I just think that's so. I mean, I grew my humanity. Yeah, and so like around that time period is probably when I learned that I love myself.
I love that. Thanks, Alexis. You're actually making me think of the Brian Stevenson quote, the attorney who wrote Just Mercy, and he says, each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I'm going to say that again. um, each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. And what's striking me right now, Alexis, is it's one thing for me from the outside to look and believe that about you. I do. I know you're so much more than the worst thing you've ever done. But I've never thought about the fact that it's a whole different, harder thing for you to come to believe that you are more than the worst thing you've ever done. So I really respect that.
Yeah, and I think in learning that, discovering that about myself, I have to look at all the horrible things I've done, and I have to face the horrible things that have been done to me, in order for me to really, right? Because I can't just love who I am right now, right? I have to love my childhood self, my teenage self, all of that. Like that's still me, And when my attorney, he said during my sentencing that hurt people hurt people. And I didn't understand that until years later, like really what that meant.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and being not okay, that's not the right word, but being like living with the responsibility of knowing that you hurt someone. That's a heavy responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. And being incarcerated, like every day you wake up, you never get to kind of zone out and escape from what you've done because you have an unfriendly reminder every day when you open your eyes. You're like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
this is where I'm here. And some days it's easier to, because you get in a routine. It's you just get up and maybe you don't think about being in jail, but there's usually something that'll happen through the course of the day, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm in prison. I was here yesterday, a lot of days before that, and it's gonna be a lot of days that I'm still in here. And I really think people underestimate the mental fortitude that it takes to like have that constant reminder of the worst thing that you've done every day, and then at the same time be able to tune that out and take steps to try to work on yourself. And I joke with y'all all the time. I was like, man, when I was in prison, I had a Bible in one hand and a shank in the other one, and I had to always live with this duality of like something like reading my Bible would take me to an extreme place of peace and serenity that didn't exist in jail. And you look around and you're like, yeah, most other people don't have this. And then you're like, oh yeah, doing jail stuff. So like, what's been like kind of the most challenging thing about like actually trying to have a real genuine faith while you're incarcerated? And then like what's been like the most rewarding thing about that at the same time?
Yeah. It is hard, right? I mean, every day I'm reminded with what I've done, and I think like that is like a natural consequence. You know what I mean? Some people like the consequences of going to prison, of course, right? But then there's millions and millions of other consequences, right? Or just natural responses to the choices that I've made. It's definitely hard being incarcerated and watching your mother get older, your siblings grow up. My grandmother, she's sick and she's, not getting healthier. My mother's getting older. My siblings are growing up. My brother just turned 18 today. And so all of those things are so emotionally impactful. They make it feel like you're just getting caved in, and you very much are. You know what I mean? I live with a lot of people who have similar crimes and I see how it's consumed them. You know what I mean? Or they just don't have the mental strength, I guess, to try to see that there is something after this. You know what I mean? And I mean, when I was 17 and I was, they said I was going to potentially do 33 years, I couldn't even conceptualize what that meant. You know what I mean? Because that was more years than I've been alive. Um, but I would say that what gets me through these years, is it's supernatural, it's God, so I don't fully understand it and I'm content with not fully understanding it. I've learned that the hard way. And I also learned that because I've developed a sense of humanity. Over the years of me being here at Echo, I've grown into somebody that feels my feelings and I can identify them. And I am not so, I've always been caring, but I've definitely been more cold and potentially callous because it's what my life is, molded me as, and it's what kept me alive all those years. And so in working through those layers and kind of looking at the ugly parts of myself, the bad habits that I've had and the bad choices that I've intentionally made or unintentionally made, I think in doing that, when you get to know yourself more, you develop a different bond with yourself. And I would say that being incarcerated all these years and just like the horrible things I've experienced here at Echo, um, I really had no choice but to face myself. And I would say that that is probably at the same time the same reason that's kept me like focused on something more. I've always had this dream of being a good wife and a good mother, and I've had that dream since I was 11 years old, listening to my mom scream and tell some horrible man to leave her alone, and it just never left me. And I would say that that was God. You would think that I wouldn't believe there was any good men in the world, um, but there are, and I just refused to believe, even when I was in treatment centers and foster care and homeless shelters, I just refused to believe that this was it. Like this was all that there was. And I mean, I meet people all the time that really believe that. Even they think like there's nothing good in the world and there's nothing more than what there is right now. And I think God put that in me. Because looking at my life, there's no reason why I should think there's good in the world or there's a good life for me, or that I'm even going to have a good husband, or I'm even going to be able to have children. But I just know that because I've experienced some of the most evil and the darkest things in life, there has to be the opposite. You can't have one without the other. And I believe like if you are intentional with your choices and your mindset, that you will gravitate towards whatever life you think possible for yourself. I realized also that nobody, no TV show, no news reporter, um, dumb podcaster could ever tell me anything that I haven't already told myself. There's no mean thing that somebody could ever say that I haven't thought of or told myself. And so when you're alone with yourself and you're also your worst demon, I mean, it's really you that you're fighting. I think of, and I fight God all the time. You know what I mean? And yeah, I think it's hard being incarcerated because you are forced to face yourself. And sooner or later, people will. Um, but I'm also very brave. And so I mean, since I was a young teenage girl, I don't know, just faced my own demons.
Alexis, in our conversations, you don't bring up the good things that you're doing there where you're at. And I think that's part of your humility and like you were just saying, like places like you're in now, it can bring out the worst in people. And but it also can bring out really good things in people as well. And you know, I hear things about you, Alexis. I hear, like you give someone a Bible without even, you do all these great things that, you don't even highlight, and you care about people in there. You try to help people in there. Um, you've told us that, hey, there's this guy in this cottage in this so and so cottage, and you guys should follow up with him. I think he's growing in his faith, and we've done so, and it's led to great fruit. But my question for you, Alexis, is what motivates you to do good, to help others in a place that doesn't necessarily make that a natural thing to do.
Yeah. Um, I would say that the thing that, as I've said before, originally, when I started to, when I was sentenced and, there was even down to like getting my GED, I mean, I definitely did it for my victim's family. I wanted so badly for them to just know, somehow see that I was doing good, right? That I was somehow a good human, because I've been portrayed to be a monster, and rightfully so. Like, I understand that and I respect that. But over the years, I've grown to love and respect myself and all these programs. You know what I mean? I've started some programs with like, this is so stupid, but I always was like, no, I can't have anything ever portray me as though I'm this horrible being, right? But over time, I realized like, well, crap, you mean I've done amazing things, and I'm still being portrayed as a monster. Well, maybe I have the wrong motives or wrong intentions, and really like living here, I've been here for so many years, and I've watched so many kids come in and out of here. And I'm no different than every single one of them, even, I mean, I don't know if I can say this, but like the most batshit crazy kids, I'm like no different than them, and I can relate to every single one of them. And I see the boys and I see my siblings in them. And I see, God gave me this gift of like, it's so interesting. Like, in going from at one point in my life to having no idea why I do what I do to then like hyperfixating on knowing myself, now I'm able, when kids misbehave or there's something going on, I'm like, well, that's actually, this is the real reason, right? Or it's so much deeper, and in the Bible it talks about like the battle is not like flesh and blood at all. It's spiritual, and it's so much more intense. And I've met some of the most remarkable human beings in my entire life that I'll ever meet. I know it, incarcerated. And it's like a 14-year-old boy who was born into a gang, and his whole life is that. And he's killed, multiple people. And yet there's something that's kind in them and loving and human, right? And that's right, like that's the proof that God exists. And so in seeing, I've been closer to some of the kids that people portray as he's evil, he's a psychopath, she's a narcissist, all these things where I just see different, and in doing, yeah, I've done some pretty awesome things while being incarcerated, but I did it, one, because it was an opportunity, and I just want to see how far I can push myself. But also I've learned like, when I got involved in the whole legislative environment and I sat in rooms and I talked to people, my whole life, people have always either only admired me because, my outside appearance, that's why they wanted to listen to me talk. They didn't really care what I had to say. They didn't care about my story, and so going into these environments where these politicians, you know what I mean? Like, they are way far above me, and yet they had no idea about anything that they claimed to either care about or have an actual ability. They had the money behind what they were claiming to know, but I actually knew, and I learned like my story matters, my opinion matters, my experience, and like there are good people who've done really, really horrible things, and I'm one of them, I will never minimize what I've done. I will never minimize what any of these young kids have done. But looking at, like, I don't think children or people are born monsters or born evil. Their environment makes them that. And sometimes they can pull through and not act on those things. Yeah, I think, I care about all these kids because I'm no different than them. And I know what it felt like. I've sat in front of many people and they've known my story, parts and pieces of it. And then they didn't do anything to help me. You know what I mean? Or they simply told me, oh, I'm so sorry, I'll pray for you. Or, oh, that's just so horrible. How are you so strong? Or all these things, or they make assumptions about how broken I am. I've been told that I'll never be able to have a good husband because I'll never be able to be equipped enough to have one, and I was just amazed at that's in itself so hurtful and traumatizing. And so I just think like if I could, everything goes back to, when I was getting sentenced and I told my victim's family that I was going to figure out why I did what I did and I was going to help other people, and that was a promise to them. And I've learned over the past couple of years that it was a promise to myself, because the family may never want to have anything to do with me. They may never want to acknowledge that I am sorry, that I am trying to be a better person, and I respect that. They don't have to. It's never my place to ever ask them for forgiveness or make them see that I'm not the worst thing that I ever did. They have the right to do that. But it is my responsibility to show up and be better and always wear my remorse very openly. Um, so yeah, if I could just be a good person to these kids, to these young girls, I always tell them, these boys, I've seen it. They come in and they're, on a crime where nobody was physically hurt, and I always tell them, like, I'm telling you, you don't want the burden of living with the knowledge that you took someone's life. And then some of them come back and you can see they're like, I get it. Like, you were right, and it's like watching them now live with demons for the rest of their life and knowing like demon will never go away and it's their responsibility to deal with the demon every day. Um, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And there are young people who heed your advice as well. I mean, we see it. And but yeah, thank you so much, Alexis. Any final words before we close for anyone?
I'll just say one thing. As I was listening to you just now, Alexis, like the words of Jesus were coming to my mind, like, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Because we live in an American culture that we incarcerate more people than anyone else. We try to take what's bad and just hide it away. I've seen people, when you were doing the hearing for like a new law in Olympia on YouTube and in the comments, people just want to push all the bad onto people like you. And you're
Yeah,
saying, well, I'm not going to do that because we all
yeah,
have good and bad in us. So I'm going to deal with my bad, not try to scapegoat someone else to run away from it. And then that's letting you look at the good in other young people who have been only defined by the bad things that they've done. It's so
yeah,
powerful. And I think it's a
yeah.
message that our whole country and humanity needs to hear. So thank you.
And I think, I guess just to encompass your guys' questions and like, how do you do it? And how do you have such strong faith and all these things? The answer is like, you have to look at the bad things you've done. You can't ignore it because
Mm.
it's like a wound. You know what I mean? You have to rip off the scab and you got to clean out the inside and then but it's constant. I mean, you have to treat it. And some wounds, I mean, some of my wounds won't heal until I experience later things in life. But I think, for our country or just people who are incarcerated and for those people who love to tell us what they would do or with their opinion of me, they have to look at the ugly parts of themselves and look at the horrible things that they've done. And I think, you can see it in the world, in our country. We're very much of like, we always deflect, it's always somebody else's fault. There's no accountability. And I went from somebody who had no accountability whatsoever. I didn't even know what that meant to thinking, oh, okay, I mean, I'm in prison, so therefore that's me taking accountability to where now I'm like, no, you have to be intentional and you have to look at the worst things that you've done. And in doing that, you have to learn to love and respect yourself and have compassion for yourself. And that's what I always try to tell the kids, like, know why you do what you do and have responsibility and own your shit. And at the same time, like, don't that's where like God comes in and he's like, hey, you owned it, girl. Like you are sorry. Now let me carry it. You mean you can carry the corner of it, but I'm carrying most of it. Like it's a team effort. And I think that that's what people should do more of. You know, all these people who want to comment on me and say things about me, um, they know that they've done horrible things. And yes, I may have done something way more horrible, but they're part of the harm, putting judgment on me, putting judgment on these kids, and claiming that they are somehow more righteous. When in reality, when you take out the bits and pieces, we're all the same.
Um, Appreciate spending this time having another conversation with you. And I'll just say for the record, some people are gonna hate you for a good reason. Some people are gonna hate you for bad reasons. Some people are gonna hate you for no reason. And you know what? That's just what they gonna do. And you can't let that stop you from your mission. And I think through your experience, you know, you've gotten some clarity on what that mission is. And we might not know what form that takes, but that big sister that's in you, that don't never go away. It's instinctual. And that's why you operate the way that you operate in your time that you've been at Echo. And even as you prepare to go on a transition, I just want to encourage you that even though you'll go from being the elder to being, more like, younger and new there, those things that God has put in you, they don't have an age on them, and you'll still have something in you that'll be rare and unique, not common, that will set you apart from people even where you're going, and you'll still be a leader, despite your age and things like that. So you will continue to learn and grow and just wear that, and you're gonna be good. So I know
Thank you.
it's about time for us to, you know, get to wrapping up and things like that. But I really wanted to, make sure, you know, we just being an encouragement to you. Because people forget that a lot, even in my personal life, you have people that you don't call and check on because you be like, oh, they strong, they got it, and your strong friends, you don't never know how close they really are behind closed doors to being on the edge, you know, and just looking at it and being like, you know what, going over might not even be that bad today. So just wanted to, on my end, just leave you with some words of encouragement because, you got this, God's going to be with you wherever you go. Uh, Joshua 1:9.
Thanks, Drew. I appreciate it. Yeah, it is a. It's interesting, right? Having been here for so long and going through what I've gone through. People always tell me like we don't know how. Like I've in all my years, I've just constantly maintained good behavior. Yeah, I mean, I haven't crashed out, as the kids say. Yeah, and it will be interesting, to transition and the environment, and also like not see it as like God's leaving me or he doesn't love me or he thinks that I'm just like, you know, not worth it or whatever, but just to embrace it and just to accept that this is part of my story, that I've done my best, and I'll continue to. So yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexis. Yeah, I think this is such an appropriate way to kick off our first video session of Unlocked. And thank you so much. I know all this stuff, I don't know exactly, but I imagine that all this um, verbalizing of what we've been through, what you've been through. I mean, it's not easy, and you're sharing it. And but as in all our conversations, you just bring it. You just bring it real, and we appreciate it so much.
Thanks. I appreciate you guys.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up, I want to thank you for being with us today. And from where we sit in Unlocked, this is an opportunity that we're giving you to go deep inside the transformation of an incredible young woman. And if you have been as inspired by Alexis as we are and want to learn more about Unlocked or how to partner with us, you can do that and find us online at youthunlocked.org, youthunlocked.org. Specifically, if you would like to make a donation that you want to go to Alexis in particular, we're going to also have an option for you to give so that it can get to her in the new facility she's headed toward. So pay attention to that as you go to youthunlocked.org. And Darrell, I wanted to ask if you could pray us out.
Dear God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for Alexis and the work that you began in her life. And we just thank you for giving us the opportunity to shed some light on the transformation that's possible. And God, we know while Alexis is an exceptional person, she doesn't have to be the exception to the rule, God. And you can touch anyone that's at Echo Glen, that's at Green Hill, that's at the group homes, that's at King County Alder Jail, God. And we just ask that you continue to equip us to do our small part in spreading your gospel to those that need it the most. I ask that you protect Alexis as she continues to the next part of her journey, God. I ask that you give her peace, God. I ask that you continue to put people in her life that will pour into her life, God, and support her and hold her up and help her grow into the woman of God that you have called her to be. I ask that you bless the ministry of Unlocked, Father God, and whoever needs to see this video, whoever needs to hear these type of stories, God, I just ask that you let it travel and get in front of those type of people, God. And I just pray for your love and your healing to penetrate our hearts and our minds, God, so that your transformational power can begin its work that only you can do on our community and on our prisons and in our households. We thank you for all things and give you all the praise. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen.